Well, I want to welcome you to our program today, and we have a very special guest with us. His name is Dr. Martin Lohrmann. He's a professor at Wartburg Seminary in Dubuque, Iowa. And so, Martin, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Yeah, very glad to be here.
Very excited. He's a history professor, and so today our topic is going to be on the person of Martin Luther. And so, but before we begin to talk about Martin Luther, just a little background about how long have you been a professor at Wartburg Seminary?
Yeah, I grew up in Walla Walla, Washington, actually, and my home pastor went to Wartburg Seminary. And as I was thinking about ministry, he recommended I visit, and I did. So as I was finishing college, I decided to attend Wartburg and had some good years here in Dubuque. I graduated just over 10 years ago from there. Then became a pastor in Toledo, Ohio, was my first church. After a while, I had a chance to do a PhD, and then went to Philadelphia, where I did a PhD in Reformation history, and also served a Lutheran congregation in that city while I was there. This is my first fall now teaching full-time at Wartburg Seminary, enjoying it very much.
Yeah, well, that's really great to hear. It sounds like you've had a very busy and productive life so far. Yeah.
That's right, both coasts.
Yeah, isn't that something? Well, glad to have you back in the area.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and so as we think about Martin Luther, and you mentioned the Reformation, and that was really quite a time in the history of our world. And so, what all was going on in our world? I mean, it was really kind of a time of change, wasn't it? I mean,
it was. It was actually a very vibrant time. Sometimes the Middle Ages get a bad rap for being a dark time, even called the Dark Ages. But as Luther was growing up, it was a time of rich spirituality. There was a lot happening in the churches, which is why there were so many ideas around him for him to use and to build upon. In 1505, he joined the observant Augustinian order of monks, so became a brother in 1505. And the folks in the monastery recognized right away that he was gifted, and they wanted him to pursue a teaching career. So he had been ordained a priest in 1508, and shortly after that began his own doctorate studies at the University of Erfurt, which is in central Germany.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what brought Martin Luther to want to be a monk in the first place?
Well, some would say, and he recalled his own kind of path of wanting to be righteous, wanting to make his way to heaven, and the best way to do it at the time was to join a monastery, to become a brother, to join a holy order, and then be on the path to heaven. So that really got him going.
Yeah, so that really was kind of viewed as a ticket then, to be a ticket to heaven if you were to join a monastic order like the Augustinians. And
yeah, he joined actually a very serious order. The observants, took it very seriously, their observance of the rule and their personal and group devotion.
How about the electric storm? Was that just kind of a tale, or did that really happen?
That's a later memory that Luther shares, probably some decades after it might have happened, when he says he was on his way back to school from his hometown, and a storm came, and he prayed for deliverance from the storm. He prayed to St. Anne, who was the patron saint of his small town he was from, and he said, "I will become a monk." And so he went back to Erfurt, and shortly after that entered the monastery. So that's a much later recollection, so we're not quite sure, day by day what he was thinking.
Because wasn't he a student of law at one time?
He was. He was an oldest son, and so his father was hoping that he would become a lawyer, a good upwardly mobile career then and now. But again, during that trip back to Erfurt from home, he decided to enter the monastery against his parents' wishes.
Yeah, so it was a disappointment to his parents at first, but Martin Luther had that strong conviction that that's what he needed to do at the time.
Yeah, exactly. I think he and his parents worked it out over the following years.
And so you mentioned the year 1505. That's when he entered the order. and then he was ordained a priest in 1508.
08?
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
All righty. And so that's where, and that was in what community?
So that was
Erfurt,
in the city of Erfurt, which
Erfurt,
was,
yeah.
at the time, I believe, the third biggest city in Germany, I recently read. So it was a cosmopolitan place relative for 15th century.
When was he ordained?
Germany.
Right in that monastery then, in a chapel there, or was it St. Marian Church?
He was ordained in the large cathedral, the dome in Erfurt. He took his vows, his monastic vows, in the monastery chapel.
Okay, that's what it was.
Yeah.
Because I got confused, because I went there once, and there's this beautiful cathedral, one of the most beautiful I'd ever seen in Erfurt, and then I heard that that's where he was ordained, but then I always thought, no, he was, but that makes sense, that he became, he did his monastic vows in the monastery there.
Yeah.
Okay, well, as a monk, you mentioned, and also then becoming a priest, and then he was recognized as being quite a scholar, hoping that he would continue his education. But he had this passion for being righteous before God and being on this path that would be a guarantee of salvation and so forth. And so he was a devout monk, would you say?
Yeah, very much. He took all the we'll say suggestions or the rules about confession very seriously, to search his conscience, to think about sins that he might not have even known he had committed. He took all those things very, very seriously. The problem was, the more he studied himself, the more he saw himself falling short. And that led to some personal crisis for him. Because on one hand, he wanted to be properly humble and recognize his sins. On the other hand, he knew that, or he thought that God rewarded the righteous. The righteous shall live by faith. Meaning, as he first heard it, be righteous, and then you'll live the right way. And he thought, how does this happen? How do I do this? So that was the bind he was in.
So it really ended up being a lot of personal consternation for him, really being in the monastery. It seemed like instead of feeling this whole sense of growing in his faith and having peace with God, he became more miserable as the days went on.
Yeah, well, it was somewhat personal, but also as a student of the Bible, he read the Bible real closely, and he would see these things like the righteous will live by faith and be righteous. And he knew from his studies also that one was supposed to make a proper confession and then do the works of satisfaction to properly be absolved. And the more he got into that, not just on a personal level, but even the academic side of all those processes for becoming right with God, he found that he just wasn't able to make it work for him. He found some contradictions almost in the system. On one hand, be humble. On the other hand, be good and be righteous. And he thought, oh, this just isn't adding up, both in the theology or in how he was understanding Scripture, and then as he experienced it personally.
Sure. And so as he was in the monastery, then he was recognized as being a very good student, a student that maybe he should go on and get his doctorate. And so where did he go for that then?
Well, he was at Erfurt at first, and then he was sent to Wittenberg, which was a relatively new university at the time, and he did some teaching and some studies there. And then he went back to Erfurt, and then finally finished up at the University of Wittenberg in 1512.
In 1512.
Yeah.
Okay, so that puts us at this point then. At 1512, now is that where he became, is that when he became a professor at the University of Wittenberg?
Yes, exactly.
1512. And what was his, was he a Bible teacher, a philosophy teacher, or theology? What was his main topic of teaching then?
Yeah, he was a doctor of theology, so in the theology department. But his early lectures were on the Bible, books of the Bible. And he started with the Psalms. In 1513 and 14, he gave his lectures on the Psalms, which is an interesting choice because it combines his monastic life. You know, as a monk, he would have been praying the Psalms and singing the Psalms every day. Combines his love of Scripture and then also the rich Christian tradition all together in that lecture.
It would have been something to have heard those lectures.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so moving along the timeline here then, as we think of the date, October 31st, 1517.
Right.
Now, why was that such a significant day?
Yeah, so by 1517, he's completed his earliest lectures as a professor, and he continued to struggle and study, really, how one becomes righteous. How do we get reconciled with God? How do we get made right with God? After the Psalms lectures, he was lecturing on the book of Romans, and it was in his study of Romans when the phrase, the righteousness of God and the righteous shall live by faith, started to mean something different to him, both through his studies and his personal experience. And that was that the righteousness of God isn't what we bring to God, but it's God who is righteous, gives it freely to sinners. As Romans 4:5 says, God who justifies the ungodly. And this kind of opened up his mind and his heart to see that it wasn't about him being righteous. It was about God who is righteous, freely giving righteousness and reconciliation to real sinners, who are then receive all of God's blessings and promises just by faith, by believing that the promise is for them.
Isn't that something? Yeah, that was such an awakening, or really a faith changing moment for him, wasn't it? Or just his whole perspective. I mean, here he was a teacher, but continues to be such a student of the Bible, but yet also just on this journey of self-examination and trying to have that peace within his heart. It just seemed like he had all that going on at once. But we're coming across those scriptures, and so it was nailing the 95 theses on the...
So we'll get to 1517,
yeah, the door. And 95 theses. Now, okay, first of all, the 95 theses, what were all these theses? Were they all dealing with the same subject, or was it all 95 different things, or how would you describe that?
Yeah. Well, so in addition to being a lecturer and a professor at the university in Wittenberg, he also had duties to preach in the city church. It was also part of his responsibilities. So he was a practicing pastor in Wittenberg, and he would hear people's confessions also. And so he knew what was going on in people's daily lives and their spiritual lives. And he learned about the sale of indulgences, not in Wittenberg, but in neighboring towns, and which promised relief from the punishments of their sins in the afterlife. And so the 95 Theses are called the 95 Theses against Indulgences. And it's a complicated system from the Middle Ages of how sins get forgiven, but indulgences were part of this. You could buy an indulgence, and that granted either full or partial forgiveness of the penalties a person owes in the afterlife, especially in purgatory. So Luther, on one hand, was an academic, and so he had his own ideas about indulgences. On the other hand, he was a pastor, and so really cared about what people were experiencing about their own sin, about how they got right with God. And so he challenged the idea in these theses. Theses are like statements for debate, main points then. He was hoping there would be a nice discussion on these main points, these 95 points, about the practice of indulgences. So he had really people's spiritual lives in mind as he did this. He wanted to say, coming from his own experience and his own study, that it's not buying anything that makes us right with God, but our trust in God is the main thing. And so he emphasizes the relationship of the believer to Christ, who gives forgiveness of sins freely. So that's really what he's getting at in the 95 Theses of 1517.
Is when you look at his life, he was so thinking that it was up to him as far as like a works righteousness, spending his time in the monastery and confessing or trying to become right. But then now you have all this, and so there's the works righteousness idea of salvation, but then now there's this whole idea of purchasing your salvation, that salvation can be purchased. But didn't the church know better than that, or what was going on? Why were they outselling salvation? Is there a reason for that, or is that or did they really truly believe that if you buy one of these indulgences or pardons for your sin, that you really are forgiven?
Yeah, well, it's a complicated idea that grew up over the centuries before Luther, but in short, the church would look to those Bible verses that say, whatever you forgive on earth is forgiven in heaven, that the church had the authority to grant forgiveness really however it wanted. So then having the ability to forgive sins then led to these kind of side things. And they were very ripe for abuse, and Luther was not the only one to have pointed this out, that they certainly could be used for greed, for selfishness. They could be used very cynically, for people to commit sins and then buy something to get off the hook with God. Yeah.
Yeah, because I always kind of wonder if the church at the time, if they really were sincere, their motivation was sincere to say, well, we want you to have peace with God, but we know that God is one that, wants you to, sacrifice something, and so here it would be, money so that you can receive your salvation, or if Martin Luther was just exposing a racket.
Yeah, oh, it depends. I like to think people were sincere for the most part, but it was, like I said, open to abuse, and there was actually very high-level finance behind the sale of that particular indulgence, actually. So when he criticized indulgences from his theological and pastoral perspective, part of the reason he got in trouble right away was because it did go pretty high in European, the power players of the time who were invested in this system.
Okay, so here he had this practice of selling of indulgences, that there were monks going around to the different communities, and people were buying their salvation and having some kind of a peace about this. And now Martin Luther challenges this with his 95 Theses. Well, how did that go over?
Well, it depends who you were. It went over like wildfire with the regular people for a lot of different reasons. People in Germany were not thrilled that their money was going to Rome. Politically, people were always suspect of the motives. It's like today. We can always assume the worst about our leaders. It's a pretty easy thing to do then and now. So for someone to challenge that was good. But also the directness, really back to the pastoral point, that the relationships believer to God is the main thing that the gospel is giving us. That also was a big reason. So Luther did not intend for those to be a popular work, those theses, but they were translated and published and spread around Germany, really without his input, but caught on very much for all those reasons.
Now, did he, as he nailed those nine, my understanding is that he took these theses, and was it just a bunch of chicken scratching that he did, or did he actually have, make sure is all, with the idea that this is going to be something that's going to be debated for the next 500 years, or, is nailing this onto a door? I mean, what was his intention with this? Was it just, have something to talk about with the students, or did he really think that this was going to be a community, national, world issue here? What do you think was his understanding or his motivation here? What was it, or maybe more the word, what was his intent?
What was his intent? Yeah. Well, the date, October 31st, 1517, is the right date. And we know this because he mailed these also to the bishops in the area. So he really meant, to be following protocol and start a conversation within the church. Most immediately, he meant to start a conversation at the university, especially among the students and the faculty, about the practice of indulgences. His intent was not that we discussed them 500 years later, I think, but that they were discussed for a little while, and then you move on to the next topic. But because they caught fire like they did, it really became the impulse behind the entire Reformation. But I think legitimately his intent was to start a discussion within the church for the sake of the church and its practices, and for regular Christians about a practice where he saw some room for abuse and trouble.
So he was then looking more to reform the church. Martin Luther, would you say that his intent was not to be a troublemaker or to split the church? I mean, he loved the church, didn't he?
Yes.
Yeah, and it wasn't like he was saying, well, here's my good chance to start a church after my own namesake. That was not his intent, was it?
No, yeah, that was very far from his mind. But he starts the 95 Theses by saying, out of love and zeal for the truth, I present these theses. So as a person whose calling it was, God had put him in the position to be a teacher of theology, which he took very seriously, and to be a pastor and someone who cares for souls. He cared that people really received the gospel, and here was a point where he thought the church's practice was maybe getting in the way of that. So he was probably a bit bold to challenge the practice the way he did, but also very much grounded in a love of the truth and love of the church.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Martin Luther, he nails on the 95 Theses to the church door in Wittenberg, and he also mails them to the bishops. So what does the church do now? I mean, it's like, do we just ignore this in hopes that it will just go away? Or if we don't contain this pretty fast, we're going to have wildfire throughout the church that we may never be able to put out. I mean, it's one of those things where, is this something that we should ignore, or do we need to take immediate action on this? Or from that date, how did things kind of unravel at that point?
Yeah, things really did escalate because people who were invested in indulgences, including his own archbishop, wanted the controversy to go away. And eventually, rather than discussing the indulgences themselves or the theology behind it, the controversy swung into a different realm, which was, why won't Luther listen to the church? Mm-hmm. And so when it became about that issue, then really people started picking sides, and Luther started challenging the institutional church per se, a lot more directly, the church in itself as where it's wrong, needing to be reformed and needing to be challenged. And so his language becomes more forceful because he wants the gospel to come first, not just obedience to the institution. And as soon as he made that step, people could attack him by saying, oh, this is a renegade. Let's get rid of him. See, he's broken his credibility.
So some just saw him then as some saw him as refreshing, saying, well, he's restoring the truth, but others then saw him as being a rebel, because those who felt that this practice was certainly a right practice in the church of selling indulgences saw this as being now an attack on that.
Yeah, and as soon as it became, why aren't you just doing what we say, then it really escalated into something else. Martin Luther against the papacy, or Martin Luther against his archbishop, Luther against the institution. Mm-hmm. And that's when, shortly after this, he was excommunicated already in 1520 and 1521. Mm-hmm. So that's a pretty short time for the lines to have been drawn so clearly.
Yeah, and so the big debate would have been the diet of worms, or that was a significant one.
Yes.
And so tell us a little bit about that debate.
Mm-hmm. Well, in 1520, Luther knew that a bull of excommunication, as it was called, was coming from Rome to label him a heretic and excommunicate him from the church. His prince, his governing authority, a prince of Saxony, didn't want him to be tried in Rome, and so arranged for him to be tried in Germany, in the city of Worms. at a diet, which is an imperial congress meeting, really, of the Holy Roman Empire. And so at that meeting in 1521, after Luther had been excommunicated by Rome, he also got a hearing in front of the Holy Roman Emperor, Charles V at the time, who agreed with Rome's excommunication of him. But that's where Luther famously said, "Here I stand, I can do no other."
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And so that was a significant time then. And so then when, okay, so so why was, so the diet of worms was one of those times that he was confronted and he was asked to recant or give up his teachings and his writings, but he said that he would not at that point.
Right.
Yeah. And so what was really now at stake for Martin Luther? I mean, as he's made this statement, and after all, you got all of this upheaval that is going on, you know, that the church now has kind of lost its patience with Martin Luther. Is that the right assessment of that? Or?
Well, he was fortunate to be protected by his own government in Saxony. And so rather than being immediately abducted then and maybe executed as a heretic, he was actually abducted by his own government and put into hiding for a while at Wartburg Castle. So our school in Dubuque here is named after that castle where he was in exile after he had been declared an outlaw and his life was really in danger. But there was enough popular support in his home area as well as around other parts of Germany that he personally was allowed to survive and that his Reformation, you know, continued to spread.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's where he was protected, and that's where he was hid out at the Wartburg Castle in Eisenach, Germany. Is that the correct place?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what. I'd say, Dr. Lohrmann, you're very interesting. I'm just so impressed by your knowledge of Martin Luther and your understanding of the Reformation, and we're kind of going through the timeline here. Mm-hmm. And so I hope that all of you would want to join us again next week as we have a part 2 to all of this. But thank you for joining us this day.